Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, now that we're in record mode, let me just say again, thank you very much, Ken, and thank everyone for showing up tonight, either virtually or at the Vanderbilt for this presentation. Um, and it's a kind of special thing for me to do this talk because it comes on the 70th anniversary year of this very fine astronomical organization. And there are a few people who might not be members of ASLE. You might be interested in joining the club because it is one of the more enthusiastic uh, astronomy organizations. I mean, a lot of astronomy clubs meet on a monthly basis. ASLE meets on a weekly basis and has many fine speakers. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to try to share my screen for all of you. This is going to be a PowerPoint presentation. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into slideshow mode. I do hope everything works out properly here. There we go. I think you can see the logo for this very fine organization. And again, we're going to
Perfect.
be talking tonight about comets, great comets of the past. And before I get into the presentation here, let me just do a little bit of a promotion for something that I am affiliated with on a nightly basis, and that is the Joe and Joe Show. If you have any interest in weather or meteorology, as Ken mentioned, for many years I was on radio and television. Unfortunately, I made the mistake of turning 68 last year. I will be 69 very soon. And unfortunately, for the people who are in charge of television, they don't like people of that age. Even if they have a lot of experience, a lot of people in my age bracket do not fall into the so-called favored demographic. So rather than just sit and, you know, get upset about the fact that we're not doing anything, my friend Joe Chiaffi, who at one time was on News 12 Long Island and also on Pix 11 in New York, he too is no longer on television. So we got together and we said, hey, we could still do something media wise. And so on YouTube, we have a nightly show. In fact, it runs from Sunday through Thursday evenings at 7:35 p.m. And all you need to do is to go online to Joe Chaffee's channel on YouTube and tune in. And each night at 7:35, we take off on Friday and Saturday. Uh, we talk about weather, not just for a couple of minutes. We go at it for sometimes as long as 45 minutes to an hour. And we just don't cover tri-state weather. We talk about weather across the country. And we have viewers, since this is, after all, the World Wide Web. We have people who watch us in Canada, in Great Britain. We even had somebody watching us in Australia. And the interesting thing is that we have a solid group of people each night who tune in, generally around 150 or so. But when the weather gets active, if there's a big storm coming, snowstorm in the winter, or maybe a hurricane or tropical system that affects us in the summertime, we see our viewership go up. We've had as many as 1,000 people tune in. We've seen that 1,000 people on our Zoom chat board, and there are many, many other people who aren't on the chat board but watch us or tune us in every night who are lurkers. So if you're interested in weather, I invite you to tune in, and if you want to join Joe Chaffee's YouTube channel, you'll get alerts as to when we're going on the air. And sometimes we go on Friday and Saturdays when there's an active weather pattern, sometimes at other times of the day too. So again, I invite you to tune in to the Joe and Joe Show. I decided to give Joe top billing with the show here. So now let's start off talking about comets. And it may sound or look rather strange to start off a talk on a screen filled with baseball players, but there's a reason for that. I didn't realize it until I did a little bit of checking, but those of you who especially are baseball fans may be interested to know that there are or have been 20,884 baseball players who have been in the major leagues since the major leagues began in the year 1869. Over 20,000 men have played the game of baseball. Some of them are quite good. They've had years where they've either hit a lot of home runs or made some spectacular catches or had some great years pitching. But there are very few ball players who are called five-tool players. In other words, they can hit, they can hit with power, they're exceptional fielders, they're exceptional runners, they're exceptional throwers. If you are a five-tool player and can maintain that bit of excellence for 12 or 15 or maybe even 20 years, then you get considered to be a superstar. And if you're a superstar, then you end up perhaps getting into the Baseball Hall of Fame, as these three examples on your screen right now. These are three of 274 Hall of Fame players. These are the players that everybody thinks about when they think about greatness, when they think about great baseball players. These are just three examples of ball players who everybody, even people who aren't into baseball, certainly a lot of people have heard of Willie, Mickey, the Duke. These are the great ball players of all time. Now, similarly, when we talk about comets, there are now, thanks to our modern technology, we are picking up on 40 to 50 new comets every year. About a dozen or so are visible at any one time with telescopes and sometimes even dimly with the naked eye. I assume that going back into the last century, well, actually going back into the 19th century, like baseball players, there have been literally thousands of comets that have passed on by. But out of all of those thousands of comets, only a few are superstars. Only a few would make it into, I guess, the Comet Hall of Fame. These are the great comets. Now, what is a great comet? A great comet is one that is stupendously bright, fantastically structured. Perhaps the tail might stretch more than a third of the way across the sky. Some comets, in fact, become so brilliant that they're even visible, however briefly, to the naked eye during the daytime. These are the Hall of Fame, the superstar comets, and they only make up only perhaps 1 or 2% of the total number of comets that have appeared over the last, let's say, couple of hundred years. So that is what we're going to be talking about tonight, are the sizzlers, the superstar comets that you often see when you open up an astronomy book. You may see a few pictures of comets. They are probably among the great comets that we're going to be talking about tonight. Now, there are also comets, there are also baseball players that have a lot of potential. They are paid a lot of money out of college or out of the minor leagues to come up to the major leagues because the people, the scouts who look at them, they say, this guy's got it all. This guy's going to be a superstar. This guy's a potential Hall of Famer. And what happens when they make it up to the major leagues? They do nothing but strike out, make a lot of outs. They are huge disappointments. They don't live up to their calling. They don't live up into the expectations. And there have been a lot of players like that in baseball. Similarly, we have had comets do just the same. There have been comets. And in my lifetime, or at least in my term as an amateur astronomer, I could recall 3 cases where we had comets that had tremendous potential. But instead of being a sizzler, they ended up being fizzlers. The one, especially if you are an old timer in this hobby, going back more than a half a century, one of the comets of note is the comet that was at one time promoted to be potentially the comet of the century, Comet Kohoutek. This comet came on by in late 1973, early 1974, and it was supposed to be a dramatically brilliant comet, but instead turned out to be more or less a dud. It didn't get much brighter than 3rd magnitude. It did get very bright for a day or two when it was passing closest to the sun, but the only ones who saw it as a spectacular sight were those who were astronauts on board Skylab. Skylab was one of the 3 original space missions space laboratory missions. We had a huge, um, as large, I guess, almost as large as the International Space Station circling the Earth. And periodically we'd have astronauts up there for many, many days, looking up at the sky and conducting experiments. And for a day or two, when Kohoutek was passing closest to the sun, it put on a great display. But as soon as it pulled away from the sun, it got very dim again. I remember still the late great Johnny Carson on the Tonight Show when he was interviewing Dr. Carl Sagan about Comet Kohoutek, and he told Dr. Sagan, he said, "Did you know, Dr. Sagan, that Comet Kohoutek is unique? It's the first comet ever to come with a fuse attached to it. It was a bomb of unbelievable proportions," and so it was a major public relations dud for amateur and professional astronomy. The next comet that was similarly a fizzler of sorts was Comet Austin. And on the cover of the February 1990 Sky and Telescope, you can see in the upper left-hand corner the announcement, "Monster Comet Coming." And that was Comet Austin. And Comet Austin, unlike Kohoutek, Comet Austin didn't even get to naked eye visibility. Instead, it turned out to be a binocular object. Big, big disappointment. It looked like for all the world it was going to be a great comet, but it turned out to be anything but. Finally, the third bomb, if you will, was this comet, Comet Ison. You may remember this was about a dozen years ago in 2013. This comet was going to come very close to the sun, become very, very bright. In this special issue put out by Astronomy magazine, Bob Berman had announced in an article about this comet that it was going to be covered in glory. Well, it was covered in something, but it wasn't covered in glory. This comet, when it came closest to the sun on Thanksgiving Day of 2013, actually disintegrated from the intense heat and light of the sun. And I find it interesting that this all happened on Thanksgiving Day. By all means, we eventually ended up calling Comet Ison the turkey of a comet. So you can see that there have been duds, there have been fizzlers, and there have been sizzlers. Now we're going to talk about the sizzlers, so to speak, the great comets. And there are some great comets that have been even greater than others. In fact, over the last 5 centuries, we have had 4 super comets. We'll start off talking about one of these super comets, which appeared in the year 1577. And here is the path that was plotted on a celestial globe. This is why, if you're looking at it, you're knowledgeable about the constellations. They are turned backwards. But again, this is the way the comet and the constellations were plotted on a celestial globe of that time, the 16th century. The first of these 4 show-stopping supercomets appeared in 1577 and was perhaps the intrinsically brightest comet ever observed. It was discovered in Peru in early November of 1577, shortly after having passed through perihelion. The distinguishing fact about this comet, according to the records, is that 1 week after perihelion, it could be seen in the twilight sky and was so bright that it shone through clouds like the moon, an incredible object indeed. 2 more weeks elapsed before the famous astronomer Tycho Brahe accidentally and independently discovered this comet by seeing its reflection in his garden fish pond during early twilight. The comet was an incredibly brilliant object, brighter at that time than the planet Venus, and had a tail extending out for 30 degrees from its head. 2 months following perihelion passage, the object was still of 0 magnitude, and it was last seen at the end of January of 1578. Indeed, a showstopper, a super comet, one far beyond the general run of even great comets. Now, unfortunately, before the 17th century, comets were not rendered artistically with very much reality. So as you can see here, we have to deal with some rather stylized drawings of comets. This is I guess you can say, a brochure that was distributed in the year 1680, alerting everybody about the appearance of a bright comet. This was the Great Comet of 1680. Now, the Great Comet of 1680 made two close approaches to the Earth as it rounded the Sun. On the way into the Sun, it reached a magnitude of +2, about as bright as the star Polaris, and it had a tail or an appendage that stretched for 20 degrees across the sky. But this was nothing compared to what was going to happen at and after perihelion. In fact, as it passed through perihelion in mid-December of 1680, the comet head became so brilliant that it was visible to the unaided eye in the daytime within a few degrees of the Sun from Albany, New York. At that time, the assumed magnitude was -6, and it was an incredible object, as you can see here. At that time, it whirled within 146,000 miles of the solar surface and then back down into the evening sky, and in the process, it grew a tail that was 70 degrees long. During January of 1681, the comet had dimmed to third magnitude, but the tail was still 55 degrees long, an absolutely stupendous object. And here now is one of the earliest factual renderings of the comet, the Great Comet of 1680. And for those of you who are familiar with the constellations, at the very top of the image, the bright star that you see here, in which the tail of the comet is over, is Altair. And the two flanking stars, this is Aquila the Eagle, low in the evening sky in late December of 1680. Here's another early rendering done by a Dutch painter, possibly done from the New York Albany area, and the painter and the painting ultimately ended up in Holland, where it is displayed at this time. Now, while it is not a purely accurate rendering, as you can see, the crescent moon here is not facing in the proper direction relative to the setting sun, one doesn't get the idea of the stupendous object that was visible at that time. Obviously, the tail here was a brilliant, brilliant thing in the late twilight. It must have been a fabulous comet indeed. Come 1744, we have another showstopper, another super comet. The Great Comet of 1744 was the grandest comet perhaps in the last 1,000 years. This comet was second magnitude at discovery late in November of 1743, and it became a brilliant naked eye object by the following January. Toward the end of January 1744, the records indicate that it exceeded the brilliance of every star in the sky, apparently -2, and it was still weeks from perihelion passage. About mid-February, the comet head had reached the brilliance of Venus, and as it passed through perihelion during the last week of February, situated 12 degrees from the sun in the daytime sky, it was visible to the unaided eye as an object of at least -5 or -6. But the greatest part of the display came after perihelion. As it reappeared in the morning sky, it produced a great celestial fan. 6 brilliant tails came up over the eastern horizon, the longest of them more than 45 degrees long. At the time, the comet head was still brighter than the planet Jupiter. Now, the appendages that you see here, the numerous appendages that are on your screen right now, were short-lived, and in fact, they lasted no more than 2 weeks. But once they had all faded away, a single brilliant ray shot out from the comet's head and attained a length in the sky of 90 degrees. The next comet to come along bears a very interesting name and one that's very familiar to all of us amateur astronomers, for it is Comet Messier of 1769. But it is sometimes known as Napoleon's comet, for in later years Napoleon considered this object his protecting genie, because it appeared at the time of his birth. And Messier, being a very politically savvy amateur and professional astronomer, wrote articles based on this and absolutely admitting this was no question a protecting genie for Napoleon. In that way, he probably retained his head if he ever was brought before the court of Mr. Napoleon all those years ago. The comet was an extraordinary object, developed very rapidly, and was observed in the morning sky. Initially, it was about 4th magnitude, but brightened up very rapidly, and on September the 10th, 1769, it reached its maximum. The head was very low in the eastern sky at about 0 to -1 magnitude. But the most impressive thing about this comet was its 100-degree tail. The comet head at the time was located in Monoceros, that's to the east of Orion, but the terminus of the tail was located in western Cetus, crossing 7 hours of right ascension. The next comet that was of considerable magnitude that came along was the Great Comet of 1843, and it is the third of the show-stopping or super comets to appear in the last 4 centuries. It is probably the parent comet of the Kreutz sun-grazing comet group, which has produced many of the most brilliant comets in recorded history. At perihelion on February 28, 1843, this comet passed a mere 126,000 miles from the solar photosphere and became one of the brightest comets in all of history when it supposedly attained briefly a magnitude of -17. It was seen by countless observers in the daytime as a brilliant object only 1 or 2 degrees from the sun in the sky. And one French report indicated that it appeared as brilliant as a flow of fire from a smelting furnace. 2 weeks following the perihelion passage of this comet, it moved too far south to be seen from European observatories, although it was well observed south of the equator. But the comet did move northward again thereafter, and initially only the tail stuck above the southwestern horizon, and raised a considerable controversy for a week or so because the head was invisible and no one in Europe was sure exactly what they were seeing. Some attributed it to some mysterious atmospheric phenomenon. But once the head emerged low above the southwestern horizon, there was no question that this was indeed the Great Comet of 1843 that had been seen in the daytime sky only a few weeks earlier. The tail grew very, very rapidly in the few weeks following perihelion passage and attained a length of 45 degrees within just a few days of the middle of the month of March. But the maximum came just a week later, when it reached 64 degrees. Now, there have been comets with longer apparent tails in the sky, as we just saw with Comet Messier, which reached 100 degrees in length. But the incredible thing about the Great Comet of 1843, in addition to the enormous brilliance, was that the fact that the projection angle for the tail was considered to be very unfavorable. And yet, the tail still managed to reach 64 degrees in length. What did that translate to? In fact, the longest tail ever recorded, more than 200 million miles in actual length. Placing the head at the sun, the tail would have extended all out beyond the Earth and all the way out to beyond the orbit of the planet Mars. Wow. Another wonderful comet of the 19th century was Donati's comet, which appeared in 1858. It was seen or discovered in early June of 1858, and from there it grew daily brighter. It is considered as a classic comet by many for its long, curving tail, beautifully illustrated here. Now, by the time this next illustration was made in late October of 1858, the head was about 0 magnitude, and as you can see here, this rendering places it just above the Cathedral of Notre Dame in France. So the head was about 0 magnitude. The long, curving, scimitar-like tail was measured out at about 45 degrees in length. By the way, this bright star right next to the comet head is Arcturus in Boötes the Herdsman, and perhaps you recognize the semicircle of stars which marks Corona Borealis, the northern crown. And this was the beautiful comet Donati, which appeared in the year 1858. Before disappearing, the comet had become so brilliant that it could be viewed telescopically in the daytime, but thereafter, as it moved into the month of November of 1858, the comet got too far south to be seen from the northern hemisphere. Only 3 years lapsed between the appearance of Donati's comet and Tebbutt's Great Comet of 1861, another comet of extraordinary brilliance, not intrinsically, but because the comet passed very close to the Earth. It was discovered in the southern sky in mid-June, all the way down in Australia, and was moving rapidly northward. It quickly passed through solar conjunction and then appeared unannounced in our northern morning sky. Now, you got to remember one thing. 160 years ago, astronomical communications were very, very slow. Today, we can go on our PCs or our smartphones and connect directly to the IAU Minor Planet Center. And many times we can learn about a new discovery literally within hours after the original observer first spotted it. This was not so 160 years ago, and sometimes weeks would pass before a discovery announcement would pass from one hemisphere over to the other. And this was the case of the Great Comet, Comet Tebet of 1861. Now, when, when Comet Tebet appeared suddenly and unexpectedly in the morning sky for the northern hemisphere, it must have been an incredible sight indeed, because some observers mistook it for the rising moon. Others indicated that the head and tail were capable of casting shadows, the only time in recorded history that a comet reportedly cast shadows. For some reason or other, the comet magnitude was officially listed as -1 at that time, but more likely it was far brighter than Venus, and the tail was enormous because we were bathed at the far end of the tail. We were literally looking down the tail toward the head. Here's the head of the comet, here's the tail, and here you see the planet Earth and the moon. And so the comet's tail actually brushed across the Earth at the end of June of 1861. And on that night when the comet was nearest to the Earth at the end of June, the comet's tail stretched a prodigious 120 degrees across the sky and had a width or spanned an arc of some 60 degrees in the heavens. In fact, the head was located down near Beta Aurigny, and if it was clear right now and you stepped outside, you'd be able to see Beta Aurigny roughly about 1/4 of the way up in the northwestern sky. So the head was near Beta Aurigny, but the terminus of the tail was over in the constellation of Ophiuchus, which is now rising in the southeast during the late evening hour. Step out tonight around, well, not tonight, but the next clear night, maybe Saturday or Sunday or Monday night. Step out tonight around 11 o'clock or midnight and just try to imagine the arc that spanned in the heavens. An incredible sight indeed. At the time that the Earth was bathed in the comet's tail, some rather strange and unique atmospheric phenomena were reported, but unfortunately, these phenomena are largely discounted today. The tail was still 97 degrees long on July the 2nd, but then rapidly dwindled. 57 degrees on July the 8th, and only a mere 30 degrees on July the 12th. The comet was followed telescopically for more than a year. Finally, the last of the show-stopping or super comets came to us in the year 1882. It was the Great September Comet of that year. And it is perhaps the brightest comet other than 1843 that has ever been seen. It was a gigantic member of the Kreutz sun-grazing comet group, and as such, it passed to within 264,000 miles of the solar surface. Now, northern hemisphere observers had no warning of this comet, or like some of the other comets, like, for example, 1861 comet, it was discovered in the southern hemisphere and not observable directly from the northern initially. But the biggest problem was nobody bothered to send a telegram north that this comet was present, because it was already at discovery the brightest object in the sky other than the sun and the moon. And I guess the idea was, for all the people who live south of the equator, why send a telegram to our northern friends when all they're going to need to do is walk out the back door and be knocked over the head by a giant comet? So there was a great problem in admitting telegrams north about the discovery. Initially, in the northern hemisphere, the comet was discovered in the daytime by Wells and several other observers, one of them a Dr. Common in England. Observing near the sun, he could actually see the comet through his dense solar filter. The comet was so bright, in fact, that it was observed up until the time it transited the sun. A South African observer compared the brilliance of the head, the surface brightness of the head of the comet, to that of the limb of the sun, to which we can infer that the magnitude must have been somewhere on the order of -15 to -20. Following perihelion passage, the comet became visible in the morning sky as an immense, brilliant object. The tail was brighter than any normal comet ever observed. In fact, one description indicates that about 3 weeks past perihelion, as twilight came on in the morning sky, when all the first magnitude stars had been swamped by the growing light of day. The comet head and 10 degrees of tail remained visible to the unaided eye. This comet continued to move away from the sun and was visible with the naked eye for more than 6 months. And even 3 months after perihelion passage, it was a third magnitude object in the midnight sky with a 15 to 20 degree tail. Truly an incredible object. The next comet that came along with the arrival of the new century, the 20th century, was the great comet Vizcaya, another comet that was discovered in the southern hemisphere in April of 1901, shortly before it had reached perihelion. It was a first magnitude object rapidly approaching the sun and became visible on the 24th of April in full daylight telescopically as an object of -2. After passing perihelion in early May, it was seen as a first magnitude object in the southern evening sky with two tails, the longest of which was 30 degrees. And the nucleus had also split into two pieces, and the two pieces were observed to move away from one another over the course of the next few months as the comet remained under observation. Another stupendous comet came to us in the year 1910, but it was not Halley's Comet. Not yet, anyway. It was the Great Daylight Comet of 1910, appearing in January of that year. It was discovered in broad daylight. The comet was clearly visible as an object, snowy white object, brighter than Venus, situated 4 to 5 degrees from the sun in the sky. There are several indications that in South Africa it was discovered in daylight, also in Delhi, India. The object moved northward and away from the sun and became a stupendous object in the evening sky for the northern hemisphere for a change. A long, sweeping tail stretched out from the comet's head to a length of more than 50 degrees. Now, this is from the front page of the New York Times, right after the comet had become visible from the immediate New York City metropolitan area. It was on a Saturday night in late January of 1910, and when the comet made its appearance felt right after sunset that night, the telephone at the New York Times switchboard began to light up. Many people were calling the Times to ask, what was that strange shaft of light that's visible in the western sky? Some thought it was maybe an unusual display of the aurora borealis. Others said, is this Halley's Comet? They knew Halley's Comet was coming back in 1910, and they thought maybe this was the first appearance of Halley's Comet, but no, it wasn't. It was the Great Daylight Comet of 1910, making its first appearance in New York in late January of that year. Now, to get an idea of the position in the sky of the comet at that time, this illustration indicates the Great Square of Pegasus. Here's the Great Square right here. Hope you can see my cursor, but here's the square, Pegasus. And the next to the head, the star just to the right of the comet head, is the star Enif, which marks the nose of the flying horse of Pegasus. So this comet covered the entire constellation of Pegasus at the time. It was a wonderful object. It remained visible for 3 months to the unaided eye. And many people in 1910 who came away thinking that they had seen Halley's Comet, in fact, probably saw the Great Daylight Comet of 1910, which appeared some 3 months ahead of Halley's Comet. But let me assure you, Halley's Comet in 1910 was no shirker either. In fact, the 1910 apparition was the finest apparition of this comet since the year 837 AD, when the comet almost collided with the Earth. In 1910, the comet, Halley's Comet, was visible to the naked eye for about 5 months. As it passed through perihelion, it became very bright, apparently on the order of -1 to -2, and the Earth may have passed through the outer edges of its tail, as you see in this diagram here, on or about the 18th of May of 1910. And at that time, the tail stretched the greatest distance across the sky of any tail ever recorded. From the southern hemisphere and for suitably placed northern observers, the tail apparently reached the prodigious length of 130 to 140 degrees. Now let me explain what you're seeing on the screen now. Back in 1910, the New York Times hired a young lady, a professional astronomer by the name of Mary Proctor, whose father was also a very famous astronomer. But they hired Mary Proctor to do daily reports on the comet as it moved through the morning sky and as it approached the Earth. And they told Mary Proctor that she should try viewing the comet from the top of the Times Tower. Now, back in 1910, the New York Times was located where else but in Times Square. And the Times Tower is now known as #1 Times Square. That is the building that every year we tune in our television sets on December 31st to watch the big illuminated ball drop to ring in the new year. I'm supposing that if I were to go on top of that building any night of the year now, I'd hardly see anything much beyond, let's say, Venus and the moon. The light pollution must be incredible from just above Times Square. But back in 1910, it was a whole different story. Back in 1910, the skies were dark enough, according to Mary Proctor, she could, on occasion, even see the Milky Way from Times Square. And this particular sketch, which was made on the morning when the tail was apparently closest to the Earth, and apparently when we were about to pass through the tail, you could see not just the sky and the stars, but also the brand new Queensboro Bridge, which had just been built the year before in 1909. So now in this particular diagram, in this illustration, we could see the terminus of the tail stretching up through Pegasus. The great square Pegasus stars are located right here, and two of the great square stars are embedded in the tail. Just above the edge of the tail, far to the west and above, is Altair, and further below and closer to the horizon shines brilliantly the planet Venus. And let me just remind you that what you're looking at here is only about 1/3 of the tail's full length in the sky. It must have been an incredible, albeit brief, apparition. The next great comet that came along was 17 years later in 1927, the comet that appeared in 1927 with the fantastic name of Scaglierup-Maristani. Another brilliant comet, but it was observed under the poorest circumstances possible. The orbital geometry was such that the comet could not be observed in a dark sky either from the northern or the southern hemisphere, which is why in this article in the New York Times, and many people were looking for this comet because there was some suggestion from somebody that this comet appearing so close to Christmas time might have been the same object that the wise men saw some 2,000 years earlier as the Star of Bethlehem. And so many people in New York were looking for this comet, but because of this position, the geometry relative to the bright sunlight, they were unable to find it. But it reached tremendous magnitude at perihelion. It too was discovered with the naked eye and was observed during the daytime from several locations, most notably one from Germany. At the time, the comet's maximum magnitude was estimated to be -5, and there are some indications that it may have been 1 or 2 magnitudes brighter than that. But now I have a question. How do you really compare an object visible in the daytime sky against nothing? The only planet available would have been Venus, -3, -4, 4.5, and then you got to extrapolate. And yet, supposedly, this comet was near to the sun, visible against the bright background. My suggestion would be, next time we have a bright and sunny afternoon, which may not be until Sunday or Monday of this weekend, but next time we do have a bright and sunny afternoon, go out and take a look at the sun and just try to conceive of how bright an object you would have to be visible within 4 or 5 degrees of the sun with the unaided eye. Incredibly brilliant object, and probably much brighter than all of the estimates indicate. Unfortunately, in looking through social media, I was only able to find that one photograph, that one image of the great comet of 1927. But the next one that came along in 1948 was a wonderful object, illustrated widely, photographed widely, and the discovery was quite unique, for it was first seen at totality during a total solar eclipse that occurred on November the 1st, 1948. Quite unexpectedly, as the sun became completely covered by the disk of the moon, there suddenly appeared a comet only 2 degrees from the sun, which was brighter than the planet Venus and had a 5-degree tail. I would have imagined that even the stodgy professionals oohed and ahed at the sight on this particular occasion. As the comet moved away from the sun, it became visible in the morning sky and was still as bright as -2 or -3 as seen from the southern hemisphere. And it also threw out a long straight tail, 15 to 20 degrees in length, as it moved out into the morning sky. Unfortunately, its declination in the sky was such that it could not be well observed in the northern hemisphere. So, uffa, again, we lost out. Uffa was a term my grandfather used to use, my Italian grandfather. But the next comet that came along in 1957 was one that favored the northern hemisphere, and it was Comet Arend-Rauland. And as it rounded the sun in April of 1957, it briefly attained a magnitude of 0, about as bright as the star Capella. And as it moved out into the evening sky, well placed in the northwest after twilight had ended, its tail extended for some 30 degrees. And an extraordinary appendage extended sunward from the head of the comet, an anti-tail visible to the unaided eye, one of the rarest of all cometary phenomena. You see it down here. And it had stretched for more than 15 degrees. So with binoculars, considering the anti-tail with the normal tail, the object could be traced for a total of 45 degrees in length in the warm spring skies of those long ago nights. I don't remember this comet. I was only about 8 or 9 months old when this comet made an appearance in the spring of 1957. A mere 5 years later came another comet, a comet by the name of Secchi-Lynes. And Secchi-Lynes is the great comet that almost nobody remembers. As it approached the sun, it was visible mainly, of course, from the southern hemisphere. The comet brightened dramatically as it neared the sun, and when it was last observed in the evening twilight, had already attained a brightness greater than the planet Mercury, or on the order of -2. On April the 1st, 1962, April Fool's Day, the comet rounded perihelion and passed to within 2.5 million miles of the sun. Predictions were that it should have attained a magnitude of -7, and yet there are no confirming observations of that fact. However, just a few days later, it was spotted in the evening sky, coming back out from the sun, already, but still an object of -2.5, and as you can see, a beautifully curving 15-degree tail. But unfortunately, immediately after perihelion, the comet receded rapidly from both the Earth and the sun, and as a consequence, it diminished very, very quickly, and it was all gone in about 4 or 5 weeks. A scant 3 years after that great comet, another great comet appeared, Comet Ikeya-Seki, 1965. And this was perhaps the brightest comet of the 20th century. It was spotted only a month before perihelion passage in the morning sky, moving rapidly toward the sun. On October 20th and 21st, the comet was seen by hundreds of observers as a brilliant object within a degree or two of the sun itself. At the time, North American estimates indicated a magnitude of -6 to -8. However, the comet was not to reach perihelion for a few more hours, and then it was going to be visible over Japan, the homeland of the observers who discovered it. And as it came to perihelion, as you see in the coronagraph pictures that are now on your screen, as it came to perihelion, many estimates indicated that it was up to or had reached -15. As it pulled away from the sun, now in full retreat, it appeared in our morning sky. A long, dense tail stretched up out of the east, a tail that could be traced for up to 20 degrees. The head faded very rapidly, but the tail continued to dominate for more than 6 weeks the morning sky. Just to give you an idea of just what kind of object we were looking at here, here's Comet Ikeya-Seki. Up here is Regulus and the sickle of Leo. Here's the triangle, which marks the hindquarters of Leo. Here's Coma Berenices, Berenice's hair over here. And out over here, you see this one lone bright star. That's Alphard. That's Cor Hydra, the star that is sometimes referred to as the lonely star in the constellation of Hydra, the sea snake. And again, down close to the horizon is the comet and its beautifully bright, long tail, Comet Ikeya-Seki, in October of 1965. Now, I have to pause in our tour of great comets to relate to you a personal story, one that is very special to me, especially in regard to my aspirations to one day be an Earth and planetary scientist. During the time when Comet Akeyaseki was putting on its brightest display, as I take a sip of juice here for a second, hold on. When Comet Akeyaseki was at its brightest, those in the eastern part of the United States, the eastern third of the country, were unable to see it. And the reason it was not visible here was because we had a spell of, I hope I'm not being politically incorrect by using this term, Indian summer. And Indian summer typically goes this way if it's October or November. The afternoons are bright, hazy, and quite mild, if not downright warm. But unfortunately, high pressure that is over the region acts like a giant lid, if you will, stagnant air. There is no wind or hardly any wind, so all of the pollutants that go up into the atmosphere don't have any place to go. And at night, all of these pollutants settle down close to the ground, and by morning when you wake up, you see fog, haze, or if you'll pardon the Yiddish expression, schmutz. And for days and days and days, while the western part of the United States and the rest of the world were enjoying this unbelievably beautiful bright comet, we here in the east, here in the New York area, saw nothing because we had these schmutzy, hazy conditions. Well, there was one man who was not going to be denied a view of the comet, and here he is. Comet Akeyaseki was to be viewed by this gentleman, the chief scientist and associate director of the Hayden Planetarium, Dr. Kenneth Franklin, a master scientist, co-discoverer of radio emissions from the planet Jupiter back in 1955. And when this comet was putting on this display, Dr. Franklin was not going to be denied. He, through the auspices of NBC Radio, the reporter for NBC Radio got together with Dr. Franklin. They managed to get hold of a 5-passenger Cessna, flew the Cessna on the morning of October 21st, just a few hours after perihelion of the comet, from Teterboro Airport to a position about 12,000 feet above West Point. And there, at 12,000 feet altitude above the schmutz layer, Dr. Franklin was able to sight in the daytime Comet Akeyaseki. Here you see this view. This was actually not a photograph. This was rendered later on by Helmut Wimmer. Helmut Wimmer was the artist at the Hayden Planetarium who created all those wonderful illustrations for the sky shows that occurred in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s at Hayden. And after Dr. Franklin got back to the planetarium, he sat down with Mr. Wimmer and it described what he saw from the aircraft. And from his description, Mr. Wimmer was able to make this sketch or this painting showing clearly the schmutz layer down below the plane. The sun was attenuated by the haze layer that sat just above the horizon, and so it appeared to be distinctly yellowed or reddened by that haze. But above that, the sky was beautifully clear. And there you see, well to the upper right, this little tiny fan-like object, and that was the comet, shining brighter still than Venus. And Dr. Franklin and the reporter from NBC Radio, describing live on NBC Radio that morning on the Big Wilson radio show, the comet as it appeared right after sunrise. And to see the comet, Dr. Franklin was probably one of the very few people east of the Mississippi who got a view of the comet in the daytime, and the visibility of it by Dr. Franklin made headlines. And it was quite a show for him. But one person especially took note of this, and that person was this guy. His name is Sonny Fox. Some of you may remember Sonny Fox from the kids' TV show Wonderama back in the 1960s. Now, some of you may have grown up on Wonderama and remembered Bob McAllister as the host of Wonderama, but Sonny came before Bob McAllister. And unlike Bob, who made Wonderama into more or less like a kiddie show, while there were cartoons when Sonny Fox hosted the show, Sonny felt that he should use Wonderama as an educational device. And so When Sonny had Wonderama, a 4 hour show on Sunday mornings, he often brought on uh, people, newsmakers, politicians, famous sports personalities, sometimes even a comedian. And in this particular case, when Sonny heard about what Dr. Franklin had seen from the Cessna, the comet, in broad daylight, he figured this would be a good time to perhaps have a scientist to tell the kids all about comets and this particular comet. And so he invited Dr. Franklin on Wonderama. And since Wonderama was one of my favorite TV shows, I was only 9 years old at the time, and Sonny Fox was one of my heroes, along with other people like Uncle Fred Scott, Chuck McCann, Sandy Becker, Soupy Sales. Sonny was one of my childhood heroes. And so when Dr. Franklin came on to talk about the comet, I found it interesting. I was just getting into astronomy at that time. And when Dr. Franklin was talking about seeing the comet from the plane, Sonny said, "Well, Dr. Franklin, I guess now that the comet has swung around the sun, it's going back out into space, we won't be able to see it anymore." And Dr. Franklin said, "No, actually not. Quite the contrary." He said, "The next couple of weeks, the comet should be very bright and very visible in our sky." And Sonny said, "Well, we're going to go to a commercial, and when we come out of the commercial, if you'll tell all the kids how they can look for it." And immediately I ran to get a pad and pencil to write down all the instructions that Dr. Franklin was going to give on how we could see this comet. He came back and he told us how we could see it. Have to get up early in the morning and have to look into the eastern sky and before sunrise. And he said, if only we had good weather. He said the weather has been so very hazy and cloudy and foggy, and we haven't been able to see it. But if we get a break in this weather anytime in the next couple of weeks, we'll get a chance to see the comet. And then it finally happened. A sharp cold front moved through, and with it came quite a different weather pattern. Beginning a few days before Halloween and continuing for about the next week, I recall clearly we had a spate of very clear, cold mornings. We could see the stars all the way down to within a few degrees of the horizon. And these were the mornings when here in New York, we were finally able to see the comet in the morning sky. Per Dr. Franklin's instructions on Wonderama, I arose 2 hours before sunrise, looked toward the southeastern sky, and there it was. You could see the tail of a Kawasaki extending almost vertically above the horizon. You could see clearly with the naked eye the comet. You couldn't miss it. The tail was right there, and using a pair of binoculars, my grandfather's hunting binoculars, I could trace the tail over its entire length. And a little while later, as the tail rose higher, the comet head became visible above the horizon. Now, without the binoculars, I couldn't see any of the detail in the head, but with binoculars, although the head of the comet was very low to the horizon, I could clearly see the small, tiny, star-like coma. I saw it on several mornings, and I was thrilled. And my mom, God rest her soul, she passed away a couple of years ago. Uh, my mom said to me, half kiddingly, "You ought to write a thank you note to Dr. Franklin and thanking him for, pointing out where you could see the comet." And you know what? That's exactly what I did. On a piece of loose leaf paper, I sat down and I hand wrote a letter to Dr. Franklin, thanking him for showing the way to how I could see the comet. And I actually added, along with the letter, a sketch. I drew a sketch of the comet as I saw it from where I lived. I was living in Throgs Neck, New York at the time. Back then, you could see quite a bit. Remember, this is only the mid 60s. Light pollution hadn't really gotten started yet. And so I drew the sketch. I sent the letter. I didn't know how to end the letter. So when I finished the letter, I wrote to Dr. Franklin. I said, "Someday I hope I have a chance to meet you in person." And I folded up the letter, sent it out, and that was that. At least that's what I thought. And then, about a few days later, about a week later, when I came home from school, my grandmother said, "You got a very official looking letter in the mail today." And when I got to the letter and I saw where it came from the American Museum Hayden Planetarium, my heart got to go the thump, the thump, the thump, the thump. And when I opened the envelope, here was the letter from Dr. Franklin, thanking me very much for my sketch of the comet and how it looked to me. And he pointed out that at that time I was looking at a tail about 35 million miles in length. And then here was the stunner. He said, "I'd like to meet you too." He said, if you call and you see there the number TR3 1300 extension 323, and if you speak with my secretary, Miss Oliver, we can make some kind of an arrangement. And we did. We did make an arrangement. On a Friday afternoon, my grandfather drove me down to the planetarium, and together we sat down, Dr. Franklin and I, 45, I'm 9 years old, for God's sake, but he spent like 45 minutes talking to me about all sorts of stuff, my interest in astronomy, what do I want to be when I grow up or whatever. And after that, he directed his secretary, who I later knew from my time, I later became on staff at the planetarium, Francine Oliver, gave me a little bag of swag, so to speak, of a few books on astronomy and souvenirs from the planetarium bookstore. That started a 40-year friendship. Dr. Franklin and I, every once in a while, I would call him up on the phone to ask him a question about astronomy. I used to exchange Christmas cards with him. As I got older and started writing articles for publications on astronomy, I'd send it over to Dr. Franklin, have him look it over and give me any kind of criticism as to how the article was. Franklin remained with the planetarium for many years thereafter. In 1983, he started a column, a weekly column in the New York Times called Skywatch, where there was a star map and a dissertation of what you could look for in the sky during that upcoming week. And then in 1997, he finally said, I need the time more than the money. He retired. But before he retired, he gave a recommendation to the Times, backed by the current director of the planetarium, Dr. Tyson, Neil deGrasse Tyson. They both said, if you're looking for somebody to take over for Dr. Tyson, Joe Rayo is the guy. Joe Rayo is our man here at the planetarium. He knows a lot about the sky and astronomy or whatever. He'd be the one to take over for Dr. Can you imagine when they told me this, and when I was told by the Times, yes, you're the new guy taking over for Dr. Franklin. And that started in January of 1998. Ken retired. He actually retired. He and his wife Charlotte in an Airstream trailer. They traveled across the country. In the wintertime, they wintered in Guadalajara, Mexico, in what he called a gringo ghetto, so to speak. 30,000 Americans living in this one community in Guadalajara. But he kept track of my writing, the column for him, the Skywatch column in the Times. Every now and then I get an email from him saying, you're doing a great job. Ken passed away in 2007. I was very, very saddened when that happened. And then in 2013, the Times told me that they were ending the run of Skywatch. Who knows? Maybe some bean counter says we got to get rid of a few things to cut corners. And so Skywatch was one of the things that they decided to cut after 30 years. And in spite of the fact that, as you can see, they gave me a very nice going away dissertation for the end of the column, I still was very, very upset. Dennis Cassia, who is, I believe, online here watching this Zoom presentation, very, very good friend of mine, very highly regarded astrophotographer who lives in Connecticut now. He knew I was upset. He sent me an email. He said, you know, the Times did a nice job with their statement, but did you ever imagine 40 years ago that you and the great Kenneth Franklin would be referenced in the same paragraph? And with that, it sobered me. It made me feel a bit better. So that's how my friendship with a great man, Ken Franklin, began with that letter that I hand wrote about Comet Akeyaseki in 1965 and what came about in the years thereafter. Oh, a postscript to the story. Sonny Fox, my hero from Wonderama, who of course retired some years later, in 2012, Sonny, who was living in California, was brought back to New York because they were having a special tribute to him as one of the pioneers of early television at the Paley Center in Manhattan. And when I found out about this, I made it a point to go down there to meet Sonny and tell him the story about how he turned me on to the Comet and to Dr. Franklin. And here you see a picture of me with Sonny. And if you're wondering why Sonny is holding a box of juju beads, it was a book signing. He had just written his autobiography, And in the autobiography, he mentioned how during one session on Wonderama, he had to do a commercial for Juju Beads, the candy, found it amazingly or incredibly funny, couldn't stop laughing, and after 2 or 3 minutes, he said, "Go to a cartoon. I can't stop laughing." And so when I saw him and I met him at the Paley Center in 2012, I gave him as a gift a box of Juju Beads. So that was my interaction with Sonny. Sonny was 88 when I had this interaction with him. Sadly, he passed away in 2020 at the age of 95 from COVID-19. But again, a very wonderful man and a very great memory of mine. But back to comets, I digress. 1970 brought Bennett's Comet, and I hope that a few of you remember that. It was a wonderful object, the finest comet for northern hemisphere skies, going back perhaps since the great January comet of 1910, found by South African amateur astronomer Jack Bennett in the far southern sky, well before perihelion passage. In late February, it was already an impressive object from southern latitudes, and on entering the twilight, southern observers rated it at first magnitude with a 15 to 20 degree tail. It appeared suddenly and dramatically in late March for the northern hemisphere in the eastern morning sky, and its elongation from the sun was considerable. It remained in a dark sky for more than an hour before twilight began. Its magnitude reached 0 to -1, and the tail could be traced for 25 to 30 degrees. Telescopically, within the head of the comet, extraordinary structures were visible. Pinwheels of gas ripped off the nucleus and extended back through the tail like some cosmic fireworks. These sketches were done by the great comet observer John Bortle, who lives not far from me in Stormville in Dutchess County, New York. For several days, the comet was visible almost to the point of daylight. Many observations indicated that it was visible within a few minutes of sunrise itself. In 1976, Comet West appeared, the third great comet in just a 9-year span. This is the discovery image of Comet West from September 24th of 1975. The image was taken from the European Southern Observatory's location, the La Silla 1-meter Schmidt telescope. Pizarro was the one who took the photograph. You may say to yourself, well, why wasn't the comet named after him? Well, he took the photograph, but it was Richard West who found the image. This is a greatly enlarged image. Notice here in the caption on Sky and Telescope, the image, this line here, measured less than 1/2 millimeter on the plate, and yet Richard West was able to find it, identify it, and so the comet became known, thanks to him, as Comet West. So as the comet approached perihelion, it brightened rapidly, reaching a magnitude of -1 to -2 in late February, as reported by Colorado observer Richard Keene. On the day of perihelion, February 25th, the comet was observed by Stephen O'Meara, Peter Collins, and John Bortle in broad daylight telescopically. And toward sunset, Bortle was able to catch the comet with the naked eye in daylight. Well, when word got out that this comet was visible even during the day to some in the daytime, well, all the different news agencies, and in this case, Comet News Service, spread the word that Comet West was exceeding brightness forecasts. It was sighted in the evening, in the daylight, and now a brilliant morning show was likely later on in the week, late in February or early in March. So several people from the AOS, the Amateur Observer Society, myself, my dear friend who just passed away, Glenn Schneider, and several other members, we traveled up to Sullivan County, New York, to a town called Jeffersonville. And we knew, at least one of our members said, oh, I know a place, there's a big, broad field, and we'd be able to have a great view of the comet. So we went up there to see Comet West. And on the morning that we woke up to see the comet and went out to the observing site, we were met by this, a completely solid overcast sky. The comet was to be visible a couple of hours before sunrise, and here we were looking at a completely, totally overcast sky on the morning of March 7th, 1976. And we were just about ready to pack up and go back to the motel that we were staying at, and suddenly, and I do not kid you, it was almost as if somebody took a knife and cut a slit in the cloud cover A rift appeared in the clouds, and then it separated, almost like a curtain separating. And there, right behind the curtain of clouds that were opening up, was Comet West. Oh, what an amazing sight it was. The comet emerged into the morning sky as an object of -1 with a huge and complex tail. A tail so complex that in binoculars it showed 5 separate components, the most since any comet since 1744. And not to be outdone by any other comet, it also fractured, the head fractured, and as many as 4 nuclei. These sketches were done by Steve O'Meara during the first week of March. As many as 4 nuclei were visible in the head of the comet, slowly separating as it moved away from the sun. The comet remained visible in the morning sky with the naked eye until late April in the year 1976. We had to wait almost 20 years, but another great comet was looming. In November of 1995, the front cover of Sky and Telescope asked this question: could this become the next great comet? Believed to be 10 times larger than Halley's Comet, newly discovered comet Hale-Bopp may grow 100 times brighter. But this was November of 95, and the comet was not due until, the spring of 1997. So we had to wait 18 months for this comet to appear. But while we were waiting for this comet to arrive, guess what? Just like in 1910, another bright comet appeared before the comet that everybody was waiting for. In 1910, we were waiting for Halley's Comet. In 1996, we were waiting for Hale-Bopp. But before Hale-Bopp came Hyakutake. And Yuji Hyakutake, as you see here pictured, was flown to America, flown to Chicago, where he was a guest of the Adler Planetarium. Hyakutake's comet was referred to by Guy Otwell of the Astronomical Calendar as the Great Upstaging Comet of 1976, because this comet became outstandingly bright and beautiful in the spring skies of 1996, 1 year before Hale-Bopp was to appear. When the comet was closest to the Earth on March 25th, 1996, 9 million miles from the Earth, Sam Storch, ASLE member Sam Storch, and I got in my minivan, my Sienna minivan, and we traveled all the way up to Hopewell Junction in Dutchess County, where the skies were really dark, even darker than what you would get, let's say, at the Custer Institute out in eastern Long Island. We wanted to get as good a view as possible of Hyakutake, and this is more or less what we saw in our sky from our vantage point in Hopewell Junction. Here you see the bowl of the Big Dipper right here. Here's the handle. Off to the top here is Mizar, and here is the bowl of the Little Dipper. Here's Kokab and Furcad. The bowl of the Little Dipper is here, and here's the comet Hyakutake, shining at magnitude 0 to -1, and the tail of the comet, from our vantage point, stretching to a length of about 40 degrees in length. Out in the western United States, where the skies are darker and where the air is cleaner, some were saying the comet tail could be viewed for as long as 80 or even 100 degrees in length. This was a magnificent comet. This was Comet Hyakutake, which came and went very quickly. Not an intrinsically bright comet, but a comet that was bright because it passed very close to the Earth. And sadly, not too long after the comet appeared, and as Hyakutake said, I loved watching it write my name across the sky. Hyakutake died of lymphoma at the young age of only 53. But there was his long legacy to the night sky, Hyakutake. And as Sky and Telescope correctly stated, it was indeed a hit. As far as what we were waiting for, Hale-Bopp, that too was a very bright comet. I call Hale-Bopp the photo-op comet, because mostly whenever you look at a picture of Hale-Bopp, it was always pictured above a famous landmark, like, for example, Stonehenge, or the Grand Tetons, or the Great Pyramids in Giza. That's usually what you saw with Hale-Bopp, was the comet along with a famous landmark somewhere on the surface of the Earth. The comet was a beautiful comet, And what made it even more special is that this comet, you know, the prerequisite for a great comet is it's got to come close to the sun and or it's got to come close to the earth. This comet did neither. This comet never came closer to the sun than 89 million miles. It never got closer to the earth than 130 million miles. I mean, if this comet had come as close to us as Hyakutake, this comet would have been as bright as -8 and had a tail probably that would have stretched across the entire sky. And yet, at that far distance from both the sun and the earth, it put on a beautiful sight, a beautiful dust tail as you see here, and also a gas tail streaming out as well. And yes, Hale-Bopp was a winner, just like Hyakutake the year before it. Now, since Hale-Bopp, we've had 3 great comets that have appeared in our sky. In January of 2007, we had Comet McNaught. In December of 2011, we had another Kreutz sun-grazing comet, Comet Lovejoy. And this year, in January of 2025, we had Comet Atlas. And all of you probably saw none of these comets because all 3 comets were basically visible only from the southern hemisphere. So once again, we here north of the equator got denied of seeing great comets because the comets decided to stay south during their period of brightest time. Now, while the law of averages says that great comets appear at an average of once every 20 to 25 years, over the last 50 years, we've had no fewer than 6 dazzlers, an average of 1 per decade, a veritable proliferation of great comets. Unfortunately, 3 of the 6, and you see them on the screen right now, were primarily visible only from the southern hemisphere. For those of us living at mid-northern latitudes, we haven't had a view of a truly great comet since Hale-Bopp, and that was, believe it or not, 28 years ago. Now, some of you probably remember Comet Neowise in 2020, or recently Comet Tushanan Atlas this past fall, and may have felt that those were great comets, but no. While both were nice comets, they fell far short of being branded as great comets. In short, if you don't remember Hale-Bopp or Hyakutake, you haven't seen anything yet, believe me. And if we're ever given a chance to see another great comet in the foreseeable future, I would strongly urge you, I'd advise you, to try to get to a location that is not light polluted. I'm afraid that those of us who stay within the boundaries of the tri-state area are not going to see a great comet in all of its splendor. In fact, you might have to travel, as Ken did at the beginning of our meeting tonight. He pointed out that he and a friend went out west and had a spectacular view of the Milky Way and beautiful stars all the way until the beginning of twilight. You may have to do something like that, or at the very least, travel to some place like Cherry Springs or somewhere in the Adirondacks or the Catskills, because the umbrella of light pollution, again, is very serious over much of the northeastern United States. But if the opportunity does come, be sure not to miss it, because as we have just seen, great comets are indeed rare and wonderful sights. Well, astronomy, as we all would agree, is the oldest of the sciences, and amateur astronomy is rightfully can claim to be the oldest of the scientific hobbies. And as I always like to end my astronomy presentations with the words of this guy, amateur astronomer Garrett P. Service. Service earned a law degree at Columbia University, but he never became an attorney. Instead, he joined the New York Sun in the year 1878 and later became a renowned popularizer of astronomy. And in 1910, Mr. Service wrote, "Surely there is not another field of human contemplation so wonderfully rich as astronomy. It's so easy to reach, so responsive to every mood, so stimulating, so uplifting, so abstracting, and immediately consoling." Now, everybody may not be a chemist. Everybody may not be a geologist. Everybody may not be a mathematician. But everybody may be and ought to be, in a modest personal way, an astronomer. For stargazing is a great medicine for the soul. Thank you very much.
Bravo.